Everyone knows the story. On April 14, 1912, the RMC Titanic, the grandest ship ever built, struck an iceberg in the frigid North Atlantic. It was one of the most infamous maritime disasters in human history. We can all picture it, thanks to books and films. A colossal wall of ice, a frantic turn, a mortal wound. But what if I told you the iceberg didn't sink the Titanic? That iceberg was just the final blow in a long and tragic chain of mistakes. The ship's fate wasn't sealed in the ice fields of the Atlantic. It was sealed by a fire that had been smoldering in its hull for days, by steel that was dangerously brittle, and by a series of shocking human errors that made this tragedy not just possible, but preventable. The story of the Titanic isn't a simple tale of man versus nature. It's a far more disturbing story of how hubris, greed, and a cascade of failures sent over 1,500 souls to their graves. The cascade of errors. To really understand how this unsinkable ship ended up at the bottom of the ocean in less than 3 hours, we have to look past the iceberg. We need to peel back the layers of myth and uncover the sequence of events, the chain of failures, where just one different decision could have changed history. It wasn't one mistake, or two, or even three. It was a domino effect of flawed design, ignored warnings, and outright negligence. We're going to break down the 5 critical failures that doomed the Titanic. Each one is a link in the chain, and together they created a perfect storm of disaster. We'll start with the very bones of the ship, the flaws that were riveted into its frame long before it ever touched the water. Then we'll move to the voyage itself, a journey marked by a hidden fire and a reckless dash through known dangers. Finally, we'll examine the collision and the chaotic aftermath, where the true cost of overconfidence was paid in human lives. This is the story of how the preventable became the inevitable. Design and construction, the fatal flaws. When the RMS Titanic slid into the water at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, it was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of an era, the largest moving object ever created by man. It was a 46,000-ton testament to industrial power and Gilded Age luxury. Engineering journals hailed it as practically unsinkable, a phrase that would become the tragedy's most haunting epitaph. This belief in its own invincibility was the first, and perhaps most fundamental, flaw. It was an attitude that infected every decision, from its design to its final fatal voyage. The source of this confidence was its celebrated safety feature, 16 watertight compartments. The idea was simple. Imagine an ice cube tray. You can fill 1 or 2 sections, but the tray itself stays afloat. The Titanic's hull was designed the same way, supposedly able to stay afloat even if its first 4 compartments were completely flooded. It was an engineering marvel that allowed the White Star Line to make a critical compromise: luxury over prudence. But these compartments had a fatal secret. The watertight bulkheads, the walls separating each compartment, didn't go all the way up to the main deck. They only rose to E-deck, just a few feet above the waterline. As the Titanic's bow dipped forward after hitting the iceberg, water filled the first compartments. Once the water level reached the top of a bulkhead, it just spilled over into the next compartment, then the next, and the next, like water overflowing the sections of that ice cube tray. It was a catastrophic design flaw. Had the bulkheads extended just a couple of decks higher, the sinking would have been drastically slowed, possibly giving rescue ships enough time to arrive. This foundational error was made worse by a problem in the very materials holding the ship together, the rivets. The Titanic was built with over 3 million of them. In the central part of the ship, the builders used high-quality steel rivets. But on the curved sections of the bow and stern, they used wrought iron rivets, which were softer and easier to hammer in by hand. Analysis of rivets recovered from the wreck shows a high concentration of slag, a glassy residue that made the iron brittle, especially in the freezing North Atlantic. When the iceberg struck, the immense pressure didn't tear a single long gash in the hull. Instead, it popped the heads off these brittle rivets, unzipping the seams of the steel plates and letting water pour into 6 separate compartments. It wasn't one wound. It was a series of fatal punctures along a stretch of nearly 300 feet. The steel of the hull plates was also more brittle than modern steel, with a high sulfur content that made it prone to shattering in cold water. These material weaknesses weren't necessarily malicious cost-cutting, but they were known limitations in an industry blinded by the promise of an unsinkable design. Pre-voyage warnings, the unseen fire. The Titanic's second great failure began long before the ship met any ice. It started deep within its hull as a secret, smoldering fire. This part of the story is often overlooked, but a compelling theory suggests it was a critical factor in the disaster. For as long as 3 weeks before the maiden voyage, a fire was raging in one of the ship's massive coal bunkers. The fire was in Coal Bunker No. 6, right up against a supposedly watertight bulkhead. For days, coal inside this 3-story-high bunker was spontaneously combusting, reaching temperatures that some experts estimate could have topped 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Coal bunker fires weren't unheard of, but this one was significant, and it was known to the ship's officers and the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, before the ship left port. In fact, photos discovered years later show a 30-foot-long dark streak on the hull's starboard side, right where the fire was burning, suggesting the heat was intense enough to discolor the paint before the journey even began. The decision was made to sail anyway. A delay would have been a public relations disaster. The plan was to manage the fire at sea by having stokers empty that bunker first, feeding the burning coal into the engines. Journalist Sanan Malani, who brought the photographic evidence to light, argues that the prolonged, intense heat likely weakened the steel of the very bulkhead designed to hold back the ocean in an emergency. By a terrible twist of fate, the iceberg struck the hull on the starboard side, in the exact area that may have been compromised by the fire. Chief Fireman Frederick Barrett, a survivor, later testified that the bulkhead wall in that area was damaged and warped from the heat. Sailing with a known uncontrolled fire raging in the hull represents a breathtaking failure of risk management. The fire didn't cause the collision, but it may have turned a serious incident into a catastrophic one. The iceberg provided the force, but the fire may have already weakened the shield. Operational blunders, speed, and ignored warnings. As the Titanic steamed into the western Atlantic on Sunday, April 14th, the placid scene masked a reckless gamble. The third catastrophic failure was one of judgment. It was a failure of the men on the bridge, who, driven by pride and pressure, steered their ship at a dangerous speed through a known minefield of ice. While the popular myth that Captain Edward Smith was chasing a speed record isn't quite true, there was pressure from the White Star Line for a celebrated early arrival in New York. As a result, Captain Smith had the Titanic running at about 20.5 knots, which was fast for the conditions. This speed was maintained despite a constant stream of warnings. On April 14th alone, the Titanic's wireless operators received at least 6 severe ice warnings from other ships like the Carpathia and the Baltic. These messages reported extensive ice directly in the Titanic's path. The crew on the bridge knew, without a doubt, they were sailing into danger. But the wireless system itself was a source of failure. In 1912, marine radio was a new luxury, mainly for passengers to send telegrams. The operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked for the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line, and their priority was lucrative passenger traffic. As the day wore on, they were swamped, and crucial ice warnings didn't always get the attention they deserved. The final, most critical warning came around 10:40 p.m. The SS Californian, a nearby vessel, had stopped for the night because it was completely surrounded by ice. Its wireless operator tried to warn the Titanic, but Jack Phillips, busy clearing a backlog of passenger messages, gave the infamous reply, "Shut up, shut up, I am busy. I am working Cape Race." That final warning that another ship just miles ahead was forced to stop never reached the bridge. Even so, Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed was a fatal error, rooted in the flawed practice of only slowing when ice was physically sighted. But more than that, it was rooted in the hubris surrounding the Titanic. Why slow down a ship that was practically unsinkable? They were racing blindly into the dark, armed with little more than misplaced faith. The collision itself, human error at the helm. At 11:40 p.m., the fourth link in the chain of failure was forged in a matter of moments. In the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lay were straining to see into the blackness of a moonless, unnervingly calm night. The calm sea was a curse. Normally, waves breaking against an iceberg create a line of white surf, making it visible. But the Atlantic was like polished glass, rendering the iceberg nearly invisible until it was dangerously close. Their task was made impossible by another shocking failure. The lookout's binoculars were locked away, and the key was in the pocket of an officer who had been transferred off the ship at the last minute. Lookout Frederick Fleet later testified that with binoculars, he could have seen the iceberg soon enough to get out of the way. When Fleet finally spotted the dark mass, he rang the warning bell and telephoned the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch gave the order, "Hard A starboard," which in 1912 meant turn the ship to port, away from the danger. He also signaled the engine room to reverse the engines. This maneuver is now seen by many experts as a fatal decision. Reversing the engines actually stopped the crucial central propeller, robbing the ship's rudder of its turning power when it was needed most. The ship became sluggish just as it needed to be agile. Some modern analyses suggest that if the Titanic had hit the iceberg head-on, the damage would have been terrible but survivable. A direct impact would have crushed the bow and flooded the first few compartments, but the ship was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 flooded. Instead, Murdoch's turn resulted in a glancing blow. An underwater spur of ice scraped along the starboard side, popping the brittle rivets and puncturing the steel plates in 6 separate compartments. It was the worst possible outcome. Instead of a localized wound, the Titanic suffered a series of smaller injuries spread over too great a length. The unsinkable design was breached. The decisions made in those 37 seconds between sighting and impact had ironically guaranteed the very outcome they were trying to prevent. This chain of errors is staggering, and the catastrophe was still only beginning. If you're finding this breakdown as fascinating as we do, take a second to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our future investigations into historical mysteries. Now, let's turn to the final failure, the tragic chaos that followed the collision. Collision chaos, the lifeboat debacle. The Titanic was mortally wounded. Within minutes, its designer, Thomas Andrews, gave Captain Smith the grim verdict. The ship was doomed and would sink in 2 hours or less. The final failure, and the one that sealed the fate of over 1,500 people, wasn't about the sinking ship, but the complete failure to save its passengers. The most damning fact is the one everyone knows. There were not enough lifeboats. The ship carried only 20 lifeboats, with enough space for 1,178 people, only about a third of the 2,200 on board. Horrifically, this was more than what was legally required by the outdated British Board of Trade Regulations, which based lifeboat numbers on a ship's tonnage, not its passenger capacity. The decision not to equip the ship with more lifeboats, despite having deck space for up to 64, was a conscious one. Extra boats were seen as cluttering the first-class deck and spoiling the view. The lifeboats were considered a way to ferry passengers to a rescue ship, not a means of total evacuation. The ship itself was supposed to be the ultimate lifeboat. This shocking shortfall was compounded by chaos and incompetence. The crew had never conducted a full lifeboat drill. When the order to launch the boats was given, there was mass confusion. With no public address system, many passengers refused to leave the brightly lit, seemingly stable ship for a tiny boat in the freezing dark. The loading of the lifeboats was a disaster. Officers on different sides of the ship interpreted the women and children first order differently. Officer Lytler, on the port side, interpreted it as women and children only, launching lifeboats dangerously underfilled. The first boat to leave, Lifeboat 7, had only 28 people aboard, despite a capacity for 65. The infamous money boat, Lifeboat 1, left with just 12 people out of a capacity for 40. In total, over 400 seats in the launched lifeboats went unused, 400 seats that could have saved 400 more lives. The final failure lay just over the horizon, with the silent shape of the SS Californian. This was the ship that had tried to warn the Titanic about the ice. Its crew saw the Titanic's distress rockets, but the captain misinterpreted them as company signals. The ship's only wireless operator had gone to bed after being told to shut up by the Titanic hours earlier. Though its ability to save everyone is debated, the Californian was close enough. Estimates range from 17 to 20 miles, that it could have potentially saved hundreds of lives had it responded. Instead, it remained stationary until morning, a silent witness to a catastrophe just a few miles away. The preventable tragedy, the sinking of the RMS Titanic, was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was the predictable result of a chain of failures, each one preventable, each one compounding the last. The iceberg wasn't the cause, it was the catalyst. The true causes were forged in the shipyard, with brittle rivets and fatally flawed bulkheads. They were stoked in the boiler rooms, where a fire was allowed to burn, weakening the ship's defenses for the sake of profit. They were found on the bridge, where a captain, blinded by hubris, raced through a known ice field, ignoring warnings that screamed of danger. And they were found in the chaotic hours of the evacuation, where a lack of lifeboats and leadership turned a crisis into a catastrophe. No single mistake sank the Titanic. It was the arrogance of believing technology could conquer nature, the negligence of prioritizing luxury over safety, and the cascade of human errors that followed. Over 1,500 people died not because of an iceberg, but because of a series of choices made by men. The legacy of the Titanic is written in the laws of the sea passed in its wake. The mandatory 24-hour radio watch, the creation of the International Ice Patrol, and the simple rule that every ship must carry enough lifeboats for every person on board. These changes, born from this tragedy, have saved countless lives. The Titanic, in its death, became a chilling lesson about the terrible cost of overconfidence, a lesson we can only hope is never forgotten. What do you think was the single biggest mistake that doomed the ship? Was it the design, the fire, the speed, or the lifeboats? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into history's pivotal moments, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.